Good afternoon, everyone. I am Thais Oliveira from University of Mato Grosso do Sul. Welcome to this afternoon session on linguistic change and construction grammar. This session is supported by Grupo de Estudos Sociofuncionalistas in collaboration between University of Mato Grosso do Sul and São Paulo State University. Today's speaker is Professor Graeme Trousdale from University of Edinburgh. First, I would like to welcome and thank Graeme, who kindly accepted to collaborate with us today. Professor Graeme Trousdale has published a number of papers on language variation, linguistic change, and construction grammar. Recently, in collaboration with Elizabeth Trogot, they published Constructionalization and Constructional Changes, a usage-based approach to the emergence of grammar that incorporates several aspects of grammaticalization and lexicalization within a unified constructional theory of sign change. Today, he will talk on new perspectives on constructionalization. So, Graeme, thank you once again, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks very much, Thaisa. Thank you all for coming to the talk today. It's a real pleasure to have been invited. I'm looking forward to talking to you and hopefully to get some feedback from you about some new ideas that Elizabeth and I have had with regards to constructionalization. I want to stress that although I'm presenting today, a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about has been done in collaboration with Elizabeth, and we'll be looking at a particular example that she's been working on quite extensively, and then I'm going to talk more about sort of the theoretical consequences of some of that research. So I'm going to start by looking at constructionalization versus constructional changes, give a sort of review of that, give a case study, the history of by the way in English, and then we'll look at some of the revised characterizations of constructionalization and constructional changes. So a relevant question for research in diachronic construction grammar is where exactly is the locus of constructional change? And the earlier work that was done in diachronic construction grammar tended to look at the poles of the construction. So, for example, it looked at the ways in which the form pole can change. We might talk about new morphology or new syntax, for example. We can also look at the change of the meaning pole. In other words, the development, for example, of new semantics. And it's this focus on the sort of poles of the constructions that had been the kind of early characteristic of some of the early work. More recently, the focus has been on, when we think about the constructional network, not so much the constructions themselves, but actually the links that exist between constructions. So we could think, for example, about how horizontal links between constructions can change. In the historical process of univerbation, for instance, the horizontal links between constructions get erased and you have simply one unit where historically there were two. People have also thought about the vertical links that exist between constructions. To what extent does a more general type sanction new, more specific types? And if that extends, how does that manifest itself, for example, in change in the productivity of a given construction? And lastly, and this is going to be very important for today's talk, there is another link that isn't always talked about, and that is the symbolic link, the intra-constructional link, one that exists in between form and meaning, that is also a connection in the constructional network. And so we'll look a little bit more at that symbolic link between form and meaning as we go on. Earlier work in diachronic construction grammar, for example, the Trogot and Trousdale book that Thaisa mentioned, explored mechanisms and motivations for change, where we understood mechanisms to be neo-analysis and analogization, and the motivations for those changes to be parsing and to be analogical thinking. And again, that work was directed towards understanding change either in form or in meaning. So an interesting question to ask is, what is the place of these mechanisms when the focus shifts from the poles of the construction, the form pole and the meaning pole, to the links either within or between constructions? And to kind of give you the end of our talk early on, what we're going to suggest is that new perspectives on constructionalization should focus on understanding the distinction between constructionalization and constructional changes in terms of that symbolic link between form and meaning, and how that is indicative of, a characteristic of, potential additions to the constructicon. So it's these two things: the symbolic link between form and meaning, and the repercussions that has for the constructicon. In the earlier work, we argued that while constructions consist of a form component, a meaning component, and that symbolic link, constructionalization referred to the creation of form new, meaning new combinations of signs. The process forms new type nodes that have a new syntax or morphology and new coded meanings, and this occurs in the linguistic population of speakers. It's accompanied by changes in degree of schematicity, productivity, and compositionality. And in this sense, the nodes in construction grammar are constructions that have links to other constructions. But we also recognized another property, that change doesn't always result in a new form meaning pairing. So when the English feature marker be going to, in some varieties of English, reduces to beginner, that's not a new form meaning pairing. And so what we argued was there was a distinction between constructionalization and constructional changes, where a change affects one internal dimension of a construction and doesn't involve the creation of a new node. Now, I think it's fair to say that since the publication of the work in 2013, there have been some strong reactions to some of the ideas that we put forward, including some strong criticism of our work. Beyaz et al., Hilpert and Flach, among other people, have criticized particularly the distinction that we made between constructionalization, the coming into being of a new form, new meaning pairing, and constructional changes, on the other hand, where changes affect just one component of a construction. For example, with regard to constructionalization, critics have said, how can a historical linguist tell when a new construction in the Traugott and Trousdale sense is tested? It's very hard to pinpoint in the historical record when this new construction has arrived. And as far as constructional changes are concerned, critics have pointed out that hardly any linguistic change involves just one factor, just one component of a construction. Specifically, Susanna Flach has argued that their confusion arises because we conflated two different meanings in the term constructionalization. There's a process reading, when we talked about something being accompanied by changes in degree of schematicity, productivity, and compositionality, and a point or result reading, which is concerned with the creation of the form new, meaning new pairing. So on the one hand, you've got this gradual process that's constructionalization, and on the other hand, you've got this idea that a new construction comes into being. And Flach suggests that, as defined in the 2013 book, the constructionalization refers simultaneously to constructional changes surrounding the new node and the creation of the new node itself. Particularly, Flach is concerned what she calls constructionalization, constructional changes, in other words, the changes that happen as a new construction comes into being, muddies this distinction that we wanted to make between process and point change. So what she suggests is we save constructionalization for the point reading, which suggests that constructionalization has to be instantaneous, and changes should be reserved for the process reading, and this may be gradual. Now, one big issue with this claim is that point implies instantaneous changes, okay? Now, we can certainly see innovations, okay? We can see, in the case of an individual text, the use of a linguistic form that had not been, to our knowledge, attested previously. But that point can be identified only for individual speakers or writers. In other words, historically, it gets manifested in individual written texts. And for us, this concerns innovation, not change. Change, we say, is conventionalization. In other words, to quote from the book, it's something that happens in the linguistic population of speakers. It is a gradual phenomenon. Now, as I say, I've given an example from Susanna Flack's very interesting research, where she points out this concern about the difference between constructionalization and constructional changes. I'm going to try and put forward a case tonight that we should, even though the distinction can be hard to maintain, nevertheless maintain that distinction. When we look as historical linguists at corpora, we can see the rise of new conventionalized associations between form and meaning. We suggest that these changes are different in kind from other types of changes that precede conventionalized associations, such that we distinguish between the preceding set of changes and the creation of a new item for the constructicon. And I'll try and explain in more detail why that's so important. We want to make that distinction because change is not innovation. This is not a new observation on our part. This is something that's been stated frequently before. And some, but not all types of change involves items being added to the constructicon, which we take as it's traditionally defined to be that shared inventory of constructions that speakers know when they know a language. So we're therefore going to propose that constructionalization should be reconceptualized as the creation of a conventionalized symbolic link between form and meaning that involves an addition of an item to the constructicon. And I'll return to this later on in the talk. By way of illustration, I want to review the development of by the way in English. This is something that Elizabeth Traugott has worked on independently and has published in a number of articles. I'm going to go over some of the main issues relating to the history of by the way today, to try to illustrate a particular development that we hope usefully provides illustration for the new characterization. So what we're interested in is how we get from point 1 to point 2 here. How do we get from an old English example where literally the sense of one is that people do not faint by the side of the road or on a particular journey, to its use as a discourse marker in 2, which is much, much later in the end of the 19th century, where we have somebody saying, all the same, Pastor, I respect you more than I did before. By the way, did I hear, or did I not, that our late lamented Uncle Peter, though unmarried, was a father? That's the historical change that I want to explore today. Now, in contemporary English, speakers and writers typically use by the way as a kind of discourse marker that will signal some sort of digression. Typically, the change is marked in a kind of offhand way to a new topic in the second discourse segment that's somehow represented as less important than the first discourse segment. So in 3, we have the discussion about reunification between East and West Germany. And this is to do with the idea that culture can be more important than economics when it comes to political associations. The second part of the discourse, the writer goes on to talk about the relationship between Eastern Germany and Poland. And that part of the discourse is less important and is introduced by this discourse marker, by the way. That's the typical use of by the way as a discourse marker in present-day English. It's not, however, the only use. We're going to focus on that first development to the stage illustrated by the Shaw example, but we recognize that there is a later development in recent English to what you might call a counter-digressive, illustrated in 4. Here's a quotation from Donald Trump. "Big Pharma ran millions of dollars of negative advertisements against me during the campaign, which I won, by the way." Now, as most of us know, the idea that Donald Trump believed that he won the last US general election is not unimportant to him. It's not something that is a less relevant or less important part of the discourse. Here, by the way, is drawing attention to the fact that he thinks that he won, not suggesting it as some sort of digression. So this is a new development, a quite recent development. We're not going to talk about that one. We're going to focus instead on this earlier development to a more standard discourse marker. So, as I said, by the way, originates in an adverbial phrase that we probably now translate as something like on the way or along the way. In other words, it's a spatial circumstantial adverbial. For a lot of the history of English, it's found both as a locative and a directional, where travel on the road is the background for some event expressed by the main verb, okay? So if we look at this example from Chaucer, you have a story of Samson, where Samson kills a lion as he's walking towards his wedding. Okay, so the main event in 5 is the slaughter and the ripping apart of the lion, and the background to that is the fact that he's walking on his way to the wedding. Slightly later in the history of English, this notion of travel and traveling along a path started to be used as background context for talk. So, for instance, in number 6, this is from Malory's Maud Arthur, Sir Tristram turned again towards the castle where Isolde was, and on the way he met with a damsel who asked about Sir Lancelot. Okay, so the important thing is that this damsel is asking about Sir Lancelot, and this talking event happened as Sir Tristram was traveling towards the castle. Same kind of example in 7 from Shakespeare. And interestingly, the kind of context gets replicated with a number of different locutionary verbs. In other words, we often find this kind of thing with things like tell, observe in the sense of mention, recount, say, etc. Ask in example 6. Now, in the 16th century, we find use of by the way in the sense of in passing, where the route becomes some sort of metaphor for argumentation. It draws on the conceptual metaphor that argument is a journey. And this argumentation journey is frequently, but not always, in the context of, say, mention or another locutionary verb, which connects these previous examples to this new development, okay? It's not always the case that the verb has to be locutionary. So, for example, in 8, we've got a discussion of ways to treat an ulcer in a 16th century medical text. And the writer here talks about the idea that digestion causes or creates matter of some sort is false science. This is what Boulain wants to suggest. So you've got this notion that, by the way, is a sense of being in passing. It's not the most important thing. The most important thing is using this red powder in order to help you recover from the ulcer. The claim that digestion doesn't cause matter or create matter is said to be false, but that's a sort of in-passing observation. And it's in the same period that we get lots of examples along the same lines. So in number 9, this much I will say, by the way, that this strait passes over the coast of Africa to the Tropic of Cancer. The fact that we get a similar kind of use with a different speaker, or a different writer in this case, suggests some degree of conventionalization. Now, these new tokens in 8 and 9 represent a very different use of by the way. It shifted from being a circumstantial adverbial to being a conjunct adverbial. In addition to this change in meaning, there are certain kinds of changes in form. For example, it's univerbated, so it's no longer possible to insert an adjective in between the article and the noun way. And it's distributed in a restricted way to a conjunct that connects these two pieces of discourse. Since, as a connective, it has a partially pragmatic meaning that's associated with in passing, this is an example of a constructionalization. We have a new symbolic link between form and meaning, and the fact that it's shared in a number of texts suggests replication. A micro-construction seems to have been added to the English constructicon. Now, we can hypothesize about how this and how similar constructions that develop to conjuncts occurred. Circumstantial adverbials can occur anywhere in the clause. Default, however, they're usually clause final from about the beginning of the 16th century onwards. In initial position, they tend to be topicalized and non-default, okay? So we've got a contrast between 10, where 10 is in the default position towards his wedding, walking by the way, and the topicalized initial position in 11, let us follow him, and by the way, let us recount our dreams. By contrast, connectives by default occur pre-clausally, and this is the position where the discourse framing occurs. In almost all cases, pre-clausal circumstantial adverbials look like their initial, and by prosody, by hypothesis, it had a different prosody from a conjunct, and we can see that example in 12. So here's a table to represent the difference in the positions between circumstantial adverbials and conjunct adverbials in the early modern English period. The typical position for circumstantial adverbials is final, and for conjunct adverbials is initial, and these get reversed in the atypical uses. A circumstantial adverbial is atypically initial. A conjunct adverbial is atypically final. What happens in the 16th century is some speakers or writers making a profile switch and reinterpreting a topicalized initial circumstantial adverbial, by the way, as a conjunct. A possible early example would be very early of the discourse marker use appears in the second half of the 16th century. where the writer says, "Here, good Christian reader, by the way, this one thing I trust, you will consider yourself. If the name of the universal bishop was given to the Bishop of Rome in the Council of Chalcedon, which was held in the year of our Lord 488, then by Mr. Harding's own admission, and by the witness of this council, the Bishop of Rome before that time had not the name of universal bishop." Okay, so this is a publication where Stapleton is trying to refute a religious argument that was put forward by Mr. Harding. In the context notice of an address to the reader, by the way, here seems to mark a new discourse topic. There's a topic shift to this one thing that he's introducing. It signals only partial relevance. There's only one thing. It's not a number of things that he needs to talk about. And it seems to be more intersubjective. Notice that he's actually addressing the reader in this part of the text. Good Christian reader, I hope you will do X, Y, and Z. So I think that this use is much closer to our contemporary discourse marker use because of the fact that it's introducing this new topic, that it's downplaying the material that comes next, and that it involves some degree of subjectivity, indeed intersubjectivity, if we draw attention to the fact that the reader is addressed in the text. In the early 17th century, by the way, starts to be used not just in these background and locutionary contexts, but also in appositional relative clauses. And as a result, it's discursively parenthetical. Here again is an example from the 17th century, again, a religious text, where, by the way, is shown to be this sort of less important part of the discourse. Now, this discourse marker use is a meaning change that reshapes a part of the construction. It doesn't involve a form change, so this again is a kind of constructional change. Later in the history of English, in the late modern period, the form starts to be used as a hedge. So it's got a kind of, it represents doing some sort of face work. The speaker or the writer represents the second discourse chunk as not being very important, downtoning what can be serious, face-threatening material. To return to our second example from George Bernard Shaw, when in the play, the character says, "All the same, Pastor, I respect you more than I did before. By the way, did I hear or did I not that our late lamented Uncle Peter, though unmarried, was a father?" At the time, the notion of being an unmarried father was socially quite scandalous. And so, by the way, here introduces something, introduces a topic that is socially very, very sensitive. Clearly then, this hedge use is very intersubjective and therefore represents a further constructional change. There is no addition of a new unit to the constructicon. All right, so if I can summarize briefly, we've got the critical development of, by the way, as a unit, a conjunct, and with the meaning in passing understood as a constructionalization. Before this constructionalization, changes occurred such that, by the way, was used in the sense talk, by the way. In other words, the journey is the context for talk. Drawing on the metaphor in writing of text being a journey. And then this profile shift, as I mentioned earlier on, from an atypical topicalized circumstantial adverbial to this default conjunct adverbial. Post-constructionalization, we see changes, for example, use in different syntactic positions, use in an appositional relative clause, and the extension in meaning to this face kind of face negotiating tactic as a hedge. We can summarize this in this table by looking at, on the left-hand column, the stage and the period. In the second column, on the form, the nature of the link, the meaning, the constructional type and the context, and the change type. So we start off in the early history of English at stage 1, for example, in Old English, with a prepositional phrase that's compositional, composed of a preposition and a noun phrase. It has a meaning by or along the way. It's a circumstantial adverbial that has some sort of spatio-temporal function. The second stage, which occurs by the middle of the early modern period, is the form has stayed the same. It's still a prepositional phrase, compositional, with the sense of by as the preposition and the way as the noun phrase, with a development of this link, but no new construction in the network. Simply an extension of meaning that instead of by or along a physical way, it means during a textual journey. This again is a circumstantial adverbial, typically found in the textual context of talking. So again, where we typically find the main verbs being asking, observing, and so on and so forth. This then constitutes a kind of constructional change. During the 16th century, there's a suggestion that we have a univerbated expression, nothing appearing in between the article and the noun, such that this has an adverbial status. It is a new link between a new form and a new meaning in passing. This is an addition to the constructicon as a conjunct, and therefore this is a kind of constructionalization. The stage in the early modern period, where it develops as a kind of discourse marker and a mitigator, is again, like this first change, simply a development in meaning. And this, like this first change, would then count as a constructional change affecting the conjunct adverbial, rather than this, a constructional change affecting the circumstantial adverbial. So it's really crucial, I think, to try to check not just the idea that there are form changes and meaning changes. The critical thing here is in this is in this cell, the stage 3 link development, where we get what we propose is a new link that works, as it were, metonymically, standing for a new construction, something that has been added to the constructional repertoire of English speakers. It's a really important distinction. So, how does this development of by the way link to our general theory then of change? The first thing is replication. And why is replication important? It's because of this notion of change being distinct from innovation. We see constructionalization as a kind of replication across speakers and writers, okay? A new symbolic link may be created in the mind of an individual, but for change to occur, we must be able to see that being replicated in the historical record. And then secondly, we have this notion of an addition to the constructicon. And this is important because if we say that knowing a language means knowing the constructions of a language, we have to be able to say that at some stage, X either is or is not a construction. That's fundamental, in our view, for a theory of construction grammar. You have to be able to say whether something is a construction or not. If you can't do that, it's a real problem for the model. That's why we have to distinguish between constructionalization, which is entry into the constructicon, and constructional changes, which involve change within an existing member of the constructicon. So just to go back to this again, here we've got this link A is trying to represent, as I say, metonymically, a construction, an entry in the English constructicon that has this syntactic form and this meaning. Now, this construction can undergo internal change such that while the form remains the same, a new meaning has arisen in the context of talk. But when you get a univariation such that the compositional syntactic structure is not characteristic of the meaning in passing, a new meaning too, then we want to suggest that something new has come into the constructicon, and that's why we give this a new link B. As a result, then, we have made the suggestion, that constructionalization should be characterized slightly different from how it was characterized in 2013. We see constructionalization as the establishment of a new conventionalized symbolic link between form and meaning, which has been replicated across a network of language users and which involves an addition to the constructicon. So this shifts the focus onto the link between form and meaning, and onto the notion of replication of an addition to the knowledge base, as it were, of speakers of a given language. It's meant to highlight this conventionalization, not just innovation. And we use establishment differentially from point, which is Flach 2020's observation, because the outcome is interpreted as a result, however short-lived it might be, of changes that involve gradual spread across members of a community, not innovations. So we recognize that these changes may not last long. Changes don't have to survive for a long time, but we do have to recognize the fact that the changes spread across members of a given community. So this is what we wanted to say about constructionalization. On constructional changes, we recognize that constructionalization is the outcome of a series of small changes that are tendencies, they're not determinative, and involve a certain set of characteristics. Typically, there is some sort of chunking or loss of compositionality within the construction. So there's a diminution of the degree to which the meaning of a construct becomes accessible. We saw this with by the way. The replication of semantic content or syntactic contexts is only loosely connected with the emerging new construction, and that increased frequency of assemblies of cotextual shifts may also occur. So, for example, in the case of by the way, this talk cotext, the idea that talk by the way was so frequent, tends to appear in examples accompanying by the way from the late 15th century onwards. What about post-constructionalization changes? Typically, we see a process of propagation across linguistic contexts. This is known as actualization. And these modifications typically are more local than those that occur prior to constructionalization, as Butz and Petre have observed. For example, the appearance of by the way in appositional relative clauses in which the discourse marker appears immediately following the relativizer. Furthermore, in by the way, there's an expansion of discourse function, for example, use as hedge, and an increase in frequency of use. If you look at token frequency, for example, in corporate, you'll see a change in the token productivity of this new construction. So what are our take-home points? Well, we've talked about constructionalization because we believe that the distinction between constructionalization and constructional changes is still relevant. An individual may well create a new symbolic link between form and meaning. Speakers may do this very, very frequently. Hearers may interpret an utterance that involves the creation of a new symbolic link. But change involves the creation of a symbolic link that is conventional. While the new symbolic link creation may be an innovation, replication of such an association, which adds to the constructicon, is a constructionalization. And language users may innovate parts of form, parts of meaning in an existing construction, and these too may be replicated. But the critical point here is that if only parts of form or parts of meaning change, nothing gets added to the constructicon. There's no new construction as such. Therefore, these are constructional changes. These new parts of form, parts of meaning, also get conventionalized. They're shared among speakers. But again, we don't have something new as a link between form and meaning. For example, when by the way is chunked and shared as a conjunct, it involves the replication of a new symbolic link in a population of speakers. As a result, we would treat this as a constructionalization. Its subsequent use as a hedge, we see as a constructional change. These are the data sources. These are some of the references. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and hopefully there will be the opportunity for some questions and comments.
Okay, thank you, Graeme, very much for your excellent talk. We actually have some questions. Let me just get them for you. Mariangela from Rio de Janeiro. She's asking, analyzation a mechanism that creates constructionalization or constructional change? How to interpret new types created in this way?
So thanks, Mariangela. That's a really good question. I don't think there's a specific mechanism of change that we would want to use that will distinguish constructionalization from constructional changes. So analyzation is a means by which change is affected that arises from our capacity to think analogically. Now, if that capacity to think analogically gives rise to a new form, we would consider that to be a constructional change. If it is the case that thinking analogically gives rise to a new link in the constructicon, a new link between form and meaning, such as that we create a new construction, then that would be a constructionalization. So it's not the mechanism of change that distinguishes constructionalization from constructional changes. It's what is created as a result of that change. And what we're proposing now is that what constitutes constructionalization is the creation of a new symbolic link between form and meaning, a focus on the links of elements in the network, not on the form and the meaning pairings themselves, form and meaning poles themselves.
Okay, thank you. Ivo, also from Rio, he's asking that considering that change is gradual, how to verify the exact moment of constructionalization? Is it possible to have some new usages, not totally different from their original properties?
Right, so I don't think it's ever possible to say Oh well, maybe I should rein back on this a little bit. I think it is extremely difficult to pinpoint the moment at which any kind of change occurs. It's possible to say that a change must have happened by a certain date. So once we see in the historical record more than one speaker or writer doing something, using a bit of language that we can't find earlier speakers or writers doing, then we know the change must have happened by that date. It doesn't mean to say that the change has happened on that date. I think all we can do is say, explore the historical record to the best of our abilities and try and find the earliest date at which something looks like it's been shared. And then what you can say is there has been a constructionalization. But because what we want to stress is that constructionalization involves sharing, it involves the idea that language users are sharing a new construction in the repertoire, then what we are looking for is a date, if you like, at which replication has occurred. And that is what we can find. So we can try and pinpoint a date by which we can talk about replication, such that we know that the sharing must have occurred no later than this. But I think that that's all any historical linguist can do. Doesn't matter to me, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about syntactic changes, phonological changes, constructionalization, grammaticalization, whatever. You're always going to be saying this has to have happened at some point before this date. But thanks, Eva. That's a really nice question.
Thank you. Carlos from Unesp, he's asking, consider that the change can only affect the form of a construction and the node and new forms can coexist synchronously. Is this stage just innovation or constructional change? What place does linguistic variation take on new perspectives on constructionalization?
Right. So again, an innovation, you're going to be able to see an innovation in an individual speaker. Yeah? And innovation is the property of an individual mind creating language, whether they create the language through speech or writing. But people innovate all the time. It doesn't necessarily mean to say that the language changes. The language will only change once something gets replicated. So if we want to say that an example like, by the way, has changed its form when it univerbates and does not, speakers no longer allow for a modification of the noun such that that becomes decategorialized. When that is happening with an individual speaker, that is an innovation. If it gets shared, if more than one speaker starts doing this, then we've got an example of a change. That was the first part. Could you repeat, Taisa? Could you repeat the second part of the question?
Is this stage just innovation or constructional change?
Okay, that was I've dealt with that one. What was the next bit?
What place does linguistic variation take on new perspectives in constructionalization, and how to represent them at the network?
Right. So I think we can talk about the same we can talk about internal variation within a construction. We can talk about the compositional, by the way, having a multitude and more than one meaning. And therefore, we can represent it as the same form with two meanings associated with it. And that would be consistent with the model that we've introduced today. So you can model it within the network, and linguistic variation is essential for change to occur. You don't get change without variation. So absolutely, I think that the variation is central.
Okay, thank you. Camila from UFSCar, she's asking whether is it possible to treat semantic compositionality apart from syntactic compositionality?
Yes. Yes, it is. And I think that is a very important, it's an important distinction to make. And I think we probably, both in the earlier work and in the rethinking, have not quite picked apart the relationship between some of the complexities associated with compositionality. So yes, I think I do think it is important to think about what we mean about the relationship between compositionality and analyzability as well. Okay, so something can be analyzable even if the meaning of the whole is not decomposable over the meaning of the parts. So I think an additional complexity is to try to understand how analyzability fits in to these kinds of changes.
Thank you. Marcia from Rio, she's asking if you consider that apparent and real-time panel and trends social linguistic studies may collaborate to measure the social conventionalization of a linguistic unit?
Yes, I mean, I think that this would be a very important dimension in tracking the ways in which new constructions come to be conventionalized. So we know from a great deal of work that's been done in historical syntax and in historical sociolinguistics about the ways in which changes can propagate across networks of speakers. I'm thinking here, for example, about a lot of the work that's been done by Terttu Neuvalainen and her colleagues in Helsinki. It's very clear that the more that we know about the characteristics of individual speakers in the past, the more we can hypothesize, or the better our hypotheses will be about the nature of the propagation of change. And this is, again, very important in Peter Petre's work in Antwerp, his mind-bending grammars project, where he's created this corpus of early modern, I think it's the Emma corpus, early modern multiloquent authors, I think the acronym stands for, where we know quite a lot about the lives of some of the writers. There's also work, for example, by David Dennison and colleagues at Manchester, where they're trying to look in some detail at the social networks of speakers to see whether the kinds of variation that we see there can explain the propagation. But critically, what I think the sociolinguistics can contribute is in the nature of the propagation of the change. how the change is shared across different speakers, what kinds of texts we see the change occurring in, how the how formality, for example, might influence the progression of the change. And also, I think it's important to say that as far as mechanisms of change are concerned, this notion of parsing and analogical thinking is not anything to do with sociolinguistics. Parsing and analogical thinking are what individuals do in their minds, So that stage in a change is extremely important. But I don't personally think that sociolinguistics tells us very much about that. Psycholinguistics can tell us an awful lot about that. And so a really good theory of change is partly psycholinguistic and partly sociolinguistic. And I think that that's what we're trying to say about constructionalization. Why we're trying to say there's a psycholinguistic dimension to the innovation and a sociolinguistic dimension to its propagation. But constructionalization involves those two things coming together.
Okay, thank you. Patricia from Federal de Juiz de Fora is asking whether the notion of social networks proposed by Milroy in social linguistics can explain the conventionalization.
I think that a more social approach to constructional change can shed light on the nature of the propagation. So we can observe in the historical record changes which maybe don't get very far. We can see things that get shared, but maybe they don't become particularly common as features of the standard variety of a language. And I think sociolinguistics generally, and social networks in particular, can help to explain why a new construction might spread more or less in a given social grouping, in a given region, and so on and so forth. So again, I think social network analysis can tell us much about propagation. I don't think it tells us as much about the psycholinguistic dimension, but it tells us an awful lot about how that change propagates in the community, definitely.
Okay, well, people are asking so much about language variation. There are a few questions here, and I'll make them just as one. Basically, how to consider the non-synonym principle that Goldberg says about to consider variation within a constructional approach.
Right, so I think so. If I understand rightly, the question is about how do we deal with the principle of no synonymy?
Yeah.
Within a kind of variation.
Yeah.
Yeah, within and understand variation. Okay, so the principle of no synonymy, as I understand it, concerns the idea that if something is semantically, if there is semantic equivalence in a construction, it will be pragmatically different. So if we look at the meaning pole of a construction, we'd be able to identify some degree of pragmatic variation if they are semantically equivalent. And if constructions are pragmatically equivalent, then they would need to be semantically different in some way. Now, I think discourse markers are particularly interesting in this regard, because of the fact that they are procedurals, because they are largely, I mean, they are very, very social in many ways. Social in the sense that a discourse marker helps the interlocutor in a spoken discourse, or the reader in a written discourse, negotiate the text. It is, you know, the discourse markers are sort of a way of guiding your interlocutor to understand the overall shape of the discourse. And so as a result, I think that this is very, it's very pertinent when it comes to understanding the nature of variability, because it's hard to think of discourse markers that are going to be pragmatically equivalent. Okay, so if you think about other discursives, or other digressives rather, like incidentally and parenthetically, I don't think they have the same pragmatic function, because they'll typically be used in texts in a different way compared to by the way. There's something about the nature of the text that you're likely to find incidentally or parenthetically compared to the kinds of text you'll find by the way.
Okay, thank you. Maura from Rio she's saying that you haven't mentioned lexical constructionalization and grammatical one. If you're still working on that distinction or not?
Yes, I think nothing that I have said about by the way would be inconsistent with what I would want to say about the development of any kind of lexical construction. I think it's also the case that the focus is on conventionalization, and the focus is on addition to the constructicon. So, for example, when you get a kind of, let's not think about word formation processes, let's think about standard lexicalizations. Standard lexicalizations have to involve the creation of a new symbolic link between form and meaning, because they will often involve a change in morphological structure. They will involve shift from either a compound to a word formation schema, or a derivational morphological schema, or from a morphological schema to a monomorpheme. And as a result, that will involve the creation of a new symbolic link, because you'll have at least one link being erased. So I don't, although the example that we've looked at, we've chosen as a really good example of procedural or grammatical constructionalization, because discourse markers do have this very strong procedural function. There's nothing in principle that would stop this being, stop the definition applying to lexical constructionalizations as well.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm sorry, but we have to wrap it up. Would you like to say anything, Graeme?
Just to say thank you all so much for coming this afternoon, for you this evening, for me. I'm sorry that I can't actually see you all in person. It's very nice to hear names of friends of mine from Brazil who I would love to be able to see in person. I hope you are all very well. I hope you're all keeping safe, and I hope it will not be long before we do actually get to meet up very soon. So thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed having this opportunity, and thank you very much for your questions, which are really going to make me think, and I'll look forward to discussing these with Elizabeth more as well. So thank you very much.
Well, once again, I would like to thank you, Graeme, for accepting our invitation and for your excellent talk. And thank you, everyone, for watching us. We have people from all around in Brazil, Portugal, Mozambique. So thank you very much. I also would like to thank Marcos and Junior for their support throughout this transmission. At times like this, when science struggles to fight ignorance and darkness, we have to make a stand. Today, I honor the over 490,000 Brazilians who lost the battle to COVID-19. Mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, daughters and sons, friends, whose lives would have been saved with only 2 shots. You will be forever remembered. As we watch nations worldwide to get back to real life, we're still fighting stage 1, uncontrolled contamination. Please stop spreading the virus. Stay in, wear a mask, and when your time comes, take the vaccine. Believe in science e viva o SUS. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Graeme, so much.
Thanks, Hazel.
It's time to wrap it up. Okay, Marcos.